Welcome to the Codcast. I'm Bruce Moll from Commonwealth Magazine, and I'm joined by the legislature's top two people on transportation, Senator Joseph Boncore of Winthrop and Representative William Straus of Mattapoisett, the chairs of the Transportation Committee. Welcome to both of you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Bruce.
Let me set the stage here. We're at a very uncertain time. The pandemic is not over yet, but there is growing hope that the worst may be behind us, and we may be headed for what some are calling a new normal, even though no one is quite sure what that is. In transportation, the pre-pandemic period was characterized by, I have to say, congestion. Most of that congestion vanished over the last year, and now I'm guessing you folks are trying to plan for what comes next. Take a minute and give us a sense of what you think the next few years will look like in transportation. Representative Straus, you want to start us off?
Sure, and thank you again to Commonwealth and to you, Bruce, and it's always a pleasure to be in this format, and especially with my colleague, Senator Boncore, as we have the honor of being back this session as co-chairs. New normal is an overused phrase already, but we can certainly see something of the indications, I think, on the transportation front. You're right, congestion is down, particularly during what people think of as the rush hours in the Boston area, especially. But one of the things from the information I've gotten from Mass Highway lately is, at least with cars and trucks, the volume is back at almost 80 to 90%. It's just occurring all around the state. So people are driving around. They're just not doing it in the same patterns. And interestingly, the area that is coming back the slowest is actually in the immediate Boston area. So the cars that bunched into the city to limit it to, or within 128 pre-COVID, are moving around, but they're moving around in different places. So lots of cars are moving, as I say, 80 to 90% already of where we were before. So gas is being consumed. Impact on roads and bridges is occurring, just in different ways. And so that's got to be part of the mix. And certainly from the legislative standpoint, and I'll cut it off there, as one of our former colleagues, Senator McGee, always used to say, every year is transportation year at the legislature, and this year will be no different.
Senator, you want to go?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just piggybacking on, I actually talked to Mayor McGee yesterday, and he said to me, it's going to be a great year for transportation policy. And I said, it certainly is. And we've certainly seen, in this pandemic, transportation take a different look. Obviously, there's more people, across the state that are working from home. So the peak hour commute, isn't the same. But we also know, I think was what Chairman Straus was talking about, is that the traffic is coming back in different ways. And we can rest assured that we will see traffic come back as we build out of this, as we build into, I guess, the new normal and build ourselves out of this pandemic. So I think we can expect traffic to come back first. And I think public transit may statewide, it may take a little longer to rebuild to where we were pre-pandemic. But I can tell you, in the city of Boston, on the Blue Line where I live, people who don't have cars, our frontline workers, our emergency workers, they are still using public transit now, and they rely on it most. So while the increase of car use outside the district is certainly, concerning for greenhouse gas emissions, we still have the same goals, or should have the same goals, I think, coming out of this pandemic, to build a system that is more equitable, more accessible, and more resilient for our climate goals.
So, Senator, you filed last month a piece of legislation dealing with a very broad piece of legislation dealing with transportation. Could you sort of sum up for our listeners what you've included in that bill and how it fits with that vision you've just talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. The Transportation New Deal, as we're calling it, represents the policies that I think we must undertake to modernize our transportation system and ensure that we're beginning to look at public transit as a public good. And I think we need to shift the paradigm on how we've looked at public transportation in this Commonwealth for far too long. So the policies included in this bill are built on those goals I was just talking to. Goals of equity, making our system more equitable, making public transit more accessible, and reducing our carbon footprint, making the system more resilient. And I think the Transportation New Deal is really a starting point. It's a transit map of all our goals, and it recognizes that the initial set of policies we must undertake to move Massachusetts forward, really to modernize the system, as I said before, and ensure that we have regional equity on the system. That we have socioeconomic equity for those who use our transit system. So, yeah, I know you asked for some specifics on what the bill includes. We're going to ensure or attempt to ensure through this bill that, everyone has adequate access to public transit, including fare-free buses on the MBTA system and the RTA. We want to continue talking about something that the chairman and I, put forth in the legislature last year during the end of the year, which was low-income fares on the MBTA system generally. I also propose that we fare freeze the MBTA for 5 years, that we begin to pilot commuter rail fares, different fares for commuter rail on off-peak hours. So people begin to look at commuter rail as just not a way into the city in the morning and a way out in the evening. But for workers who are coming in on the commuter rail, if their parents get sick or their child needs to be picked up from school, we have frequent all-day service that they can get home on if need be. And of course, we want to pilot late-night service on the MBTA and expand parking at commuter rail stations to kind of move towards a more hub-and-spoke transportation model where people aren't driving all the way into the most congested area in the entire country, and that being Greater Boston. But we can incentivize people to drive to a commuter rail, have a parking spot, get on the train, and work the rest of the way in. So those are some of the policy proposals. I mean, it obviously includes, other things like parking surcharges and regional ballot initiatives, as well as toll equity, and creating a roadway task force to look into things that I've been talking about for some time now, including roadway and congestion pricing, and really more toll equity across the Commonwealth. So it's a long bill, Bruce. It's about 48 pages long, and those are some of the highlights.
So, and I know in there, this is a segue, in there is a proposal to increase the gas tax too, presumably to fund some of these initiatives. Now that's something, Representative, that the House passed last year, along with some other measures. What's your reaction to this bill? I know you've had a chance to think about it a little bit. Is it for you, yep, that's it, we're going with that? Or is it a good starting point, or how do you see it?
Well, I really appreciate that the Senate is jumping in clearly this session. Last year was a unique one in so many ways, but often going back to the emergency impacts that we had to deal with COVID. When the House put its plan out there, and we didn't have a name, we just said we got to pay for transportation. So we did two bills last March, and then COVID hit. And as the co-chair points out, in conference committee, we were able, both bodies, to take on some of these issues. Unfortunately, all of the good things that deal with the kind of issues the senator is talking about were vetoed by the governor, but we can get back to that in a little bit. But I absolutely agree with my co-chair that transportation, and to me, it's all public transportation, whether it's the roads or the subways or the buses or commuter rail, is really all part of our public transportation system. We utilize it in different ways. So I'm excited that the bill has the aspirational things that everyone wants in imagining what the perfect transportation system will be. But so many of the things there cost a lot more than even the 12 cents or the gas tax numbers that are in there. And that's always the trick. But building on what the House did with revenue last session, I'm taking the bill as an indication that Senate, because my co-chair is also in on the leadership meetings on the Senate side, that this reflects broadly the Senate's desire this session to engage with the House on not just what the transportation system should look like, but we have to begin the discussion of how to pay for it. And on just one point, the one that Bruce, you identified, and Senator Boncore identifies, making the buses free, and also elsewhere in the bill suggesting that all modes of not just the T, but the regional transit authorities might end up being free. That's a multi-billion-dollar issue. And so everyone likes free, but if transportation is a public good, I always have described it as a utility in a sense. It's as vital as electric and water and the other and communications utilities. And there's a cost, whether we acknowledge it or not. So if you say to one part of the system, those who get on the bus or the subway, your ride is free, the cost of providing that did not simply disappear. And again, with regard to the T, the fare box system-wide is just under $700 million a year. If we had to have free bus service in the RTAs, it would require a 40% jump in what the state now provides as annual contract assistance to the RTAs. So it's important to focus on the goals. It's equally important, if not more, to focus on how do you get there, and that's probably going to be the kind of legislative discussions that we're prepared for. We have history, certainly the senator and I, in working through these. So I'm optimistic, even though clearly we're going to have some disagreements in how to get there.
Senator, let me ask you a few questions, sort of riffing off that. First off, is the representative right that the filing of this bill is more than it's your bill? It's sort of a Senate take on where we're going, or how would you describe it?
I would say, we're excited to hear like, of course, is that the co-chairs' values are aligned with some of the priorities in this bill. I mean, this bill is the Senate Transportation Committee chairman's, take on, what really the needs are to modernize our transportation system across the state. It's come from a lot of work and meetings with the advocacy community, low-income communities, obviously the Senate's Transportation Working Group, to get to where we are. And it is a broad set of the values. The Senate believes, we need to make our system a more equitable system.
And so when you talk about free bus service, I'm just sort of curious how that works in a way, because it's an interesting idea that has bubbled up in just the last few years. Maybe it was all the rage sometime before, but in the last few years, people and more have started to talk about this. And I'm sort of, it seems like you've elevated it to a whole new level with this legislation. And I was curious, what happened? You think it's the right time right now?
We've been looking at the system. We've been looking at the inequities in the system. And we believe buses are the most equitable form of public transportation that we use, and that constituents use, people across the Commonwealth use. So we felt like this could bring the most equity to the system. And I want to talk about it. It's not just free buses. I mean, I'm acutely aware of the cost of doing this. And we call it fare-free buses because it really, on the MBTA and the RTA buses, it is a critical step to ensuring equity and access to public transit. Before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, half of all commuters on MBTA buses were people of color. And almost half of those commuters were low income or on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale in Massachusetts. Now, in the midst of this pandemic, we need to ensure that these people have transit access. They rely on it most. So pricing low-income commuters out of affordable public transit, I just think is antithetical to our goals of ensuring public transit is a public good. So, not only will this help people who are out of work not have to worry about what the cost of the bus is, and it won't have to, and now, single mothers, single fathers, who don't have T access, who rely solely on the bus as a way of getting their groceries, who may be out of work, won't have to worry about the cost of moving about the Commonwealth. So there are those goals. Obviously, free buses and getting more people out of their cars and onto the bus system would lead to less congestion on our roadways, and it also benefits sustainability, in reducing our carbon footprint and greater efficiencies on our buses too, if people can just get on and off without paying.
If I could, this is a great comparison and maybe a civics point also as to a reminder how the legislature is populated with people from districts from all around the state. My district includes New Bedford, which is among the hardest hit in terms of economic impacts, and a very diverse ethnic population as well. And I have to resist the notion, even though we have a regional transit authority, which does a very good job. Please, no one should take the point that that the people who drive cars are all uniformly well off. So much of the working poor live in remote areas or even urban areas, and that car is how they get around. So that's why when the House did its revenue piece, it focused in part on the gas tax, but also on corporate excise taxes, on car rental fees, on TNC fees. It was balanced, but one of the things I do see in the Senate bill, and this is the point of these kind of discussions, is it's proposes much larger increase in gas tax than the House had done before. And so while offering a very positive approach to the notion of free fares, but let's remember this, that the balance that you end up as a result, if you just took the Senate proposal as a whole, is you're asking the working poor and anyone else who buys gasoline to bear the bigger share of the cost, without recognizing that people travel all modes, who come from all economic strata throughout the state. So one of the things has to be a balance here. If we could do cheaper gas, of course, everyone would like that too. So again, the system has a certain cost, and you can't, in the name of equity, inequitably visit the costs on only one part of the traveling public. And that's part of the dynamic I see here. So the goal when you talk about free fares, the approach I've taken is with the buses, because you mentioned, Bruce, how this has grown. When you look around the country, you can do free fare public transit systems that are targeted based on promoting a certain district or area, and those have worked. I'm thinking right now in the Denver area. So you can make use of a free fare system, but it's tied into some other things that are going on, either in a neighborhood or a business district, something like that. To uniformly say no fares occur anymore, that's a difficult one because of the obvious cost impacts here that we really don't have the numbers on. But I can say, based on revenue that comes in and the capital needs that would be represented, we'd have to come up with at least, in excess of $1 billion a year by my initial count in order to make this transition. And unless people are proposing, and that's a tough number to come up with for just transportation, unless people have a revenue package in that realm, this is going to be a heavy lift.
So, Senator, the representative's calling it a heavy lift, and I guess my reaction is it's a big proposal in all respects. In part because, as you probably know, the T is now spending, I think, close to $1 billion to change the way it collects fares. And so the Baker administration, at least, is full on board with fares. So this would be a very interesting but dramatic change in the way we do business. And maybe I want to give you a chance to respond.
Well, I appreciate that. I'd love to respond. I mean, I think this bill, I'd have to disagree. I think this bill takes a statewide approach. It's not just about improving the MBTA, but it's about improving the entire transportation system. And of course, there's a cost of that. But there's a cost that for too long our constituents and riders of this Commonwealth have borne. And that's the cost of doing nothing. And we can't continue to hide behind the cost of what things actually cost. We need to be able to build out of this pandemic. We need to make our transit system a more equitable one. And we're going to have to absorb the cost. Now, my understanding of the cost of making fare-free buses is about $60 to $90 million a year. That would free the fare on the buses in the MBTA system and on the RTA system. So I'm concerned about others thinking it can be $1 billion cost, because I just don't see it that way. And to your point, Bruce, I mean, we're spending $1 billion to collect these fares. And no one's really batting an eyelash, and that program has now been delayed. The costs have gone up on that, on what it's going to cost to do that. And we're spending $1 billion on just collecting fares, and no one's talking about that. Where on the higher end of where I see this cost is about $60 million a year. So I think this is why we file bills at the beginning of the session. I'm not under the impression, and I'm sure the chairman would agree with me. We rarely see a bill as it's filed be signed by the governor, right? And that's what the legislative process is. We'll engage in these conversations with all parties that want to have these conversations. The House, the Senate, certainly, with the administration, with MassDOT, the MBTA, as this bill moves along. But I got to say, it's time in public transportation and in our transportation system that we change the paradigm on how we think of these things. And something's got to change, because what the product we're putting out as a Commonwealth is not good enough. And the people of this Commonwealth deserve more. For too long, what's the cost associated, I have to ask, associated with our roads? And those are fare free. No one's paying user fees on our roads. So I think there's ways we can kind of reconcile with that. I've been a long time proponent of congestion charges and sort of toll equity across the Commonwealth. Peak hour pricing on our roadways, I think, is something we could do to address that. But the cost on this, I want to be clear, $30 to $60 million. Even when we consider paratransit and the cost of that, it will bring the cost up a little bit. But we're not looking at $1 billion proposal. The only $1 billion proposal on the table right now is a proposal to begin to collect fares anyway.
If I could, a couple of quick points. Look, I'm looking at the MBTA's revenue source sheet from 2019. Bus revenue alone was $97 million. So that tells you just for free buses, it's a hit right there. And then under federal regulations, when you talk about paratransit, those fares are linked to the paratransit, the ride service. Those fares are linked to what the fares are elsewhere in your system. So you have to give up the ride paratransit fares as well on subways, because inevitably this extends beyond buses. Those of the same means who ride the subway are going to look at free buses and say, where's the logical argument? And that's $300 million a year in fares on subways alone. We haven't talked about the Regional Transit Authority. Is there an excise tax on the roads? Of course there is. It's called the gas tax. It goes into the Transportation Trust Fund, and that's the main source of how we pay for the roads and bridges and provide the Chapter 90 funding. But I do want to indicate how much in the bill represents what we already do agree on, the House and Senate, because we haven't talked about it. We came up with some very detailed compromises last session. Again, the governor didn't like them, but maybe we'll have a different outcome this time with a longer schedule. But on TNC, Uber and Lyft fees, we have an agreement that the House and Senate have been on. And on this issue, we're both in agreement, both chambers, on some sort of fare reduction program for those in need within the T service area. And we came up with a dedicated source of money for that in the TNC terms we came to. We also came to agreement on the so-called Transportation Climate Initiative revenue that, as derived from motor fuel taxes and fees under the state constitution, the House and Senate are on record, and the governor vetoed it, that this money has to be spent on transportation. The governor's much more interested, it seems, in diverting some of the transportation money into important environmental projects, but you can't do that under the state constitution. So there's a lot we agree on. Clearly, you've drawn out of us without too much prodding, Bruce, where we have disagreements on some of these revenue issues. But as my co-chair points out, that's part of the legislative process, ultimately to come to a consensus and then bring the governor on board when we can.
Yeah. Bruce, if I could just chime in here, I do want to agree. I think we absolutely have a shared vision, the chairman and I, on where Massachusetts need to be on TNC fees, on low-income fares, and other similar and like policies. And I'm excited this bill has prompted these conversations around the transportation world across the Commonwealth, and it's kind of generating some buzz because, that's the intent. But I must say, we cannot, paratransit has come up often, right? And I think it's kind of unacceptable and insensitive to use those who utilize public transit as an excuse. And I'm not saying anyone's doing that. I've seen the MBTA and the administration do this and put out the fact that, well, we need to pay for paratransit, so we can't have free buses or fare-free buses. And I think that's a wrong way of looking at that. I think we do need a paradigm shift. More so on that point, it's not a one-for-one. It's not as though if we have a fare-free bus, that every ride on the ride is going to have to be free. The federal government and the American Disabilities Act says you have to provide the same ride for those in paratransit that have utilized on a bus. So if there's a bus system and the bus is going along a route and someone in paratransit wants to go along that route, that's what the state needs to provide as a one-to-one payoff. But we know that the cost of paratransit is more utilized than on common bus routes. So we know that the cost of paratransit, is bore across the state by people who are going to doctor's appointments, going to grocery stores, and going places that are outside the cost. And we haven't had the conversation. The MBTA sort of has been unwilling to have the conversation of what the actual cost is if for paratransit and to be included on this proposal, because it's not a one-to-one. Well, all paratransit must be free now. And there are federal subsidies we get for paratransit and other things that are part of this conversation. But it's a very involved conversation. It's a very in the weeds conversation, and we just need to be willing this session to have that conversation and so many more to build our public transportation into what it needs to be.
Well, with that, I think our listeners are getting a sense of what the debate is going to be in the Transportation Committee as we move forward. And it's going to be a very interesting one to watch, maybe the most interesting in a long time. And And that's saying something, actually. So I want to thank you, Representative Straus, Senator Boncore. Thanks for joining us today. And
My pleasure.
And Senator, thank you. And I look forward to having another conversation down the road when you guys shake hands and reach an agreement on what we need to do. Thanks very much.
Of course.
Sounds good. Be well, Bruce.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening this week. And we'll see you again next week for another edition of the podcast.